Look, there's no easy way to talk about this. Alice Munro was, of course, a giant of Canadian literature. But this week, some troubling revelations came out, and I think they make us reconsider how we talk about Alice's work. Today on the podcast, why we need to revisit Alice Munro's legacy. I'm Elamin Abdul-Mahmoud. This is Commotion. Let me first start off by saying I wish we weren't having this conversation. I really do. And then let me just also say, let me give you a heads up that this conversation will be difficult in some moments. So if this is not the time for you to be engaging in it, that is totally okay. But we have to talk about this. We have to talk about this because we have to figure out what to do with Alice Munro. We have to figure out how to talk about the information that we learned this week, that she knew her husband sexually abused her daughter when she was 9 years old. And Alice chose to stay with him and stay silent. There is probably no Canadian writer that was more loved or more admired than Alice Munro, and that, it does seem, was a part of the problem. Like, it wasn't just Alice Munro who knew. Other family members knew, her biographer knew, some people in the Canadian literary establishment were aware. They did all choose to stay silent. Now you have readers who are grieving. Some of them are feeling furious. Some of them are feeling betrayed. And they're asking if they can keep reading Alice Munro, convinced that her stories will never be the same again, if you will. We have three writers with us to work through these questions. Michelle Cyca is a journalist in BC. Michelle Dean is a writer who grew up in the Ottawa Valley, not far from when so many of Alice Munro's stories were set. She's in LA. And Zoe Whittall is an author based in Prince Edward County, Ontario. Michelle, and Zoe, welcome to the show, friends.
Hi.
Hi.
Mm-hmm.
Listen, before we get into this, I want to say that this is not Alice Munro's story. It is her daughter's story. It is Andrea Skinner's story. The story of a survivor's courage to speak up despite being ignored since she was 9 years old. This story did not come about as some kind of leak. Andrea herself published a piece in the Toronto Star earlier this week. For anyone who has not read the piece that Andrea Skinner published in the Toronto Star, Michelle, maybe I'll start with you, Michelle Cyca. I'll start with you. What was your reaction to reading Andrea's story?
I mean, I think when I saw the headline, like so many other people, I was really filled with dread, but I don't think that I was prepared for how harrowing it was. However bad you think it'll be, when you understand the details of the story, I think it's so much worse. And as a parent of two little kids, I have a little girl and a baby boy. I mean, it was just devastating to think about a child going through what Andrea went through.
Mm-hmm.
But I mean, two things that struck me immediately. One is how this wasn't the first time she was telling the story. She told it to her father when it happened. Her stepmother knew, her siblings knew, eventually Alice knew. She told so many people in her life, and every adult in her life really failed to protect her.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the second thing I thought was just, how is it only coming out now when it was such an open secret? Like her stepmother, Carol, talks about how journalists would ask her about it at parties.
Yeah.
And I think that's just something we're really grappling with, is that Alice Munro had this huge legacy, this huge importance in Canadian society and Canadian literature. And so understanding why this story is something we're only hearing now requires us to think about, who she was and what she meant.
Mm-hmm. Michelle Dean, I think there is shock, because of the details involved. And then there is surprise, and they do seem to be two separate emotions. You wrote that you were not surprised by Andrea's revelations about her sexual abuse and her family's silence. Why was it not a surprise for you, do you think?
Well, I think it's not because I had any knowledge or anything of special knowledge. I just wanted to clarify that to begin with. But I think I've heard so many of these stories now, like both as a journalist and my own family, et cetera. And also there's just like a particular thing about Ontario small town life that is reflected here in the idea that people just don't say anything when they should say something. So that was a part of it. So that I think my surprise, to the extent it existed, was really more kind of a recognition of the pattern that was being described within the family and actually within larger Canadian society itself. And sad to say.
Zoe, I'm curious about so many dimensions of this story because it is so complicated, and yet there is like this gut reaction appears to be so simple, right? Like Alice Munro must be a terrible mother, a terrible person for staying with the man who sexually abused her 9-year-old child. That's sort of like the big gut reaction that maybe hits a lot of people. Do we blame Alice Munro? Is that how we proceed about this? What do you make of that sort of initial gut reaction?
Well, I think that while, we can't ever know an artist, we only know their text, but I think that the emotional reaction that I had was especially with the details of how often she told her story, how often she told the people who were supposed to protect her,
Mm.
and then later in life, how often she reached out and pitched journalists or talked to people in the industry. Um, you know, it's hard not to think that this was an indefensible act, and that she not only made one impulsive bad decision that you could empathize with, given the shock of the situation. She like continually chose herself and chose her husband, and chose not to protect her daughter when she was a child and when she was an adult, and she also chose not to protect her own grandchildren,
Hmm.
and continually took the position of her as the victim, and choosing to frame the childhood sexual abuse as an infidelity. All of these things that just feel like it is very hard not to
Hmm.
put the blame on her, even though we don't know her as a person,
Yeah,
we don't know her in real life.
I think one dimension that feels really difficult to grapple with, and maybe I'll pose this to Michelle C. Is this idea of the way that Alice Munro wrote specifically about the lives of girls and women, the secrets that are kept, infidelity and sexual abuse. Like the fact that this happened to her daughter, and her stepfather, her reaction to it, they are kind of baked into Alice Munro's life's work. And I think that makes it a bit more complicated. How are you reading her differently now? How do you feel about what you're reading when you read Alice Munro?
I mean, I haven't read any Alice Munro since reading Andrea's story in The Star, but for one thing, I've seen a lot of people saying, should we even be reading Alice Munro at all? Now that we know, like I've seen people saying they're throwing her books away. And I think that's an interesting and kind of personal moral calculus. Like, for one thing, she's dead, so she's not profiting anymore if you read her work. It's not like going to see a Woody Allen movie in the theaters. But I do think, as you say, this was really the themes in her work. And while I don't think that we should necessarily assume everything a fiction writer is writing is drawn from their life, the way we appraise art and understand writing does evolve over time as we learn things about the context in which it was created. And this is really important context. And she wrote not only about secrets, but about the ways people lie to themselves, about the choices they make. My colleague Taja Eisen wrote in The Walrus that Munro's stories really resisted catharsis. So her characters would often kind of glimpse a different sort of life, and then they would choose to turn away from it and stay in the familiar. And I think that's something that we're reading differently too. Alice Munro had many opportunities to be a different kind of mother, a different kind of person, and she chose the life that was familiar to her, the one that she wanted. And I think we can see in her work the way we're really capable of blinding ourselves to information that we don't want to know.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point I've began so many sentences with, and that's what's so hard about this, but it's like there's so many things that are so difficult about this. And one of them is that there are so many examples in the work, right? Like one that stands out is a short story that was published in 1993. It's called Vandals. It is written from the perspective of a child who was sexually assaulted by a man, ostensibly without that wife's knowledge. Zoe, do you think Alice Munro was trying to resolve problems in fiction that she couldn't necessarily face or confront in real life? Like, is that a fair reading of some of this work now, you think?
Well, I think so. I opened up the copy of Runaway that I've had on the side of my bed since her death, and reading it is a truly different experience. And I looked over Vandals, and it really felt to me like, writers often try to emotionally reckon with their own demons and like the inescapable parts of their autobiography that make it into fiction. And they do that on the page because it's the place that they can control those narratives. And I think there's a way to do it in disguise where you can do that kind of emotional reckoning and personal self-discovery, and then you can in a way, like not be in denial while you're doing this kind of artistic investigation, and then you continue to be in denial in your real life, which, you know, and denial was such a theme in her work, and secrets and gaps and all of these things. I do really think that when you look over her work, and I went back and I listened to old interviews, and you can really tell that this is the irresolvable obsession that she dealt with creatively instead of emotionally, and instead of relationally, with the people she loved. And that's, you know, created some incredible art, but, you know, was such a sad thing in her real life.
Michelle Dean, I think like that we talk all the time about this idea of separating the art from the artist. There are moments when you can, and there are moments when you can't. And I think the idea that Zoe just said, the idea that, you know, if an artist is trying to work through a thing creatively instead of doing it relationally, then your relationship necessarily changes to that art. You know, if you subtly are confronted with the knowledge that the things that they should have been facing in real life, they only face in that art can kind of no longer be separated from the artist in a way. Is that how you're feeling about a story like Vandals, or just like Alice Munro's work in general?
Yeah, I mean, I think I felt this way independently of this revelation, although this revelation like heightened and deepened my commitment to this idea. Writers often like to say in interviews and otherwise that, you know, their work shouldn't be read as autobiography. They feel, fiction writers, they often feel resentful that it's been read as autobiography. And yet, I think the more you know about the lives of writers, which I've written pretty extensively about, the more you realize that all of them are simply wrestling with their experience. It's not quite the sort of Anne of Green Gables sentimental write only what you know kind of thing, but at the same time, like especially, you know, Vandals in particular, it is actually kind of a split perspective between the girl who was abused and then this woman who is married to the abuser, and some of the things that are said in that story about the woman who is married to the abuser and her deliberate decision to not remember what she saw. You can't help but feel that Munro was kind of saying something about this. And I think it's too soon in a way to say exactly how our reading of her work will change. When you look at somebody like Woody Allen, who is the person that people always bring up in these conversations, his work now we see all laced all through it, this sort of obsession with youth and young girls, and a certain shallowness that some people perceived at the time that it was airing, but others don't. Whether you know, in the Munro case, we're going to start to feel the work is deeper or that the work is actually more shallow, that piece I'm not sure about yet. But no matter what, of course, that's what writers are doing, because what else? I don't know what other perspective they'd write from than their own experience.
I think, first of all, let me just name a heaviness over this whole conversation, because it is a heavy conversation, and I'm grateful that you're all here with me to do it. My name is Elamin Abdul-Mahmoud. This show is called Commotion, and today I'm with Michelle Cyca and Michelle Dean and Zoe Whittall, and we're muddling through what to do with Alice Munro, whether it's possible to separate the towering amount of work that she's left, which is just an incredible amount of body of work that is all incredible from what we learned earlier this week. And maybe, Michelle Cyca, I want to take a moment to listen to an interview that Alice Munro did with Paula Todd from 2006. At the time, Alice Munro would have known about her daughter's sexual abuse for many, many years. And just bear with me here, because I think we have to sit through some of this conversation for a moment. Let's listen to it.
I think of it as a silly period, or perhaps a regrettable period, in terms of maybe the way we related to our children. I feel there probably that it would have been better if we'd gone on being mothers and fathers.
Give me an example of something you might have said, or some behavior that you think is regrettable.
Well, just the way, it was more negative things, the way I didn't get alarmed about drugs, and I didn't really know very much about drugs, and I didn't get alarmed about bad language, and I didn't get upset about, I assumed that my children would have sex at a certain stage, you know, and I think maybe what children want is not an enlightened parent. They want a mother standing at the ironing board saying, I don't know what the world is coming to. They want something, you know, that is very different and very firm, and that seems to them quite idiotic. But at least it isn't boundaries being erased. However, that wasn't the kind of person I was, so I couldn't have done it.
Michelle, when you hear that, Michelle Cyca, when you hear that, you hear a bit of a distance when it comes to the idea of Alice Munro and her approach to motherhood. What comes up for you listening to that?
I mean, I think it's a really interesting theme in how people have talked about Alice Munro, like that she was a mother, is so baked into the subjects of her work, but also when she was written about as a writer, it was, you know, sort of intrinsic to the framing of the profile that she was Canadian and she was a mother and very concerned with matters of domesticity. I think that's something that's been discussed a lot since her death in many of the tributes was the way that her work was kind of transgressive about sex and sexuality, which are themes that I think are reading quite differently now. But what she's saying there is reflected in her work. She was interested in transgressing boundaries and the sexuality of girls and women. But what's challenging listening to her talk about what she was like as a mother, I think Alice Munro was really protected by our ideas of motherhood and the idea that she was a good mother, you know, that her interest in domesticity as a creative theme, I think was comforting to people, that she was so attuned to the lives of mothers and children. And she was protected by our ideas of what a mother will do for her kids, whether she was explicit about it or not. You know, the reaction I've seen so much in the last few days is what kind of mother could allow this to happen to her daughter? You know, no mother would do this. And that's a belief about what she must have been like that she protected or was protected by. And something I was struck by in Andrea's story was how she, you know, her breaking point was Alice telling an interviewer what a close relationship she had with her kids, like what a kind of perfect domestic life she had. I think she had room to sort of subvert that by talking about herself as a transgressive artist, as a boundary breaker, while also, I think, playing into these ideas of herself as inherently a good mother. And she did that because she is such a familiar figure. You know, she was a nice white Canadian lady from small town Ontario. She was very familiar to people. She was a comforting figure in many ways, and that protected her from scrutiny.
I maybe want to take that opportunity, Zoe, to widen the aperture just a little bit, because this is not just about a family that chose to keep a secret. Like Gerald Fremlin pleaded guilty to a charge of indecent assault. This was on the record. The husband of Canada's most famous writer, right? A convicted criminal. This is something that a lot of people knew about. We now know that Alice Munro's biographer was aware. You know, her Canadian editor and publisher, Douglas Gibson, was aware. And others too. Andrea Skinner and had sort of repeatedly said she reached out to journalists over the years. Now, what do you make of the collective choice, Zoe, to maybe keep this a little bit on the down low?
I think that it's both understandable and so frustrating. I think that the publishing industry is financially incentivized to protect the publishing industry. Like, I think that, you know, 20, 30 years ago when I got into publishing, there were always a lot of rumors about the lengths that publishers will go to protect the scrutiny of specifically male artists most of the time. And then now there's this sort of, you know, it's gone totally different where there's now so much effort and so much money put into protecting authors before they come out, in terms of making sure that they know every single secret before they sign contracts, et cetera. And so I think that, you know, we like to think that people, you know, if there's a generous reading, we think, okay, maybe people didn't think it was their place. Maybe people felt like they had a personal connection to Alice, and so they felt stuck and unsure what to do. But you know, I think the reality of it is that people benefited financially from her success, and that she was also a, you know, such an icon in a way that she's the only one in Canadian arts and letters that made it beyond our borders in this way. And I think that there's an unwillingness to kind of bring her down, so to speak. And I think even though like culturally we love to push people off pedestals, I think that Alice Munro was like one of these confusing exceptions to that rule. And it was very sad to read how often Andrea tried to get her story told, and that this was the only time it came out.
I also I want to complicate all of this by saying, you know, some of the stuff we know is like, we know that, like, for example, like Alice Munro briefly left the home and then came back to that home later. We don't. I don't think you can completely understand it as, you know, this is somebody who did absolutely nothing, but it's also somebody who in the end ended up making a choice, and that's the choice that we're sort of trying to grapple with at this moment. Michelle Dean, in the piece that you wrote for the cut, you talk about how people who keep secrets like this are often powerful. Then they could blow the whistle, but they don't. And you have this devastating line, which is the Andreas of the world pay the price, and that's just what it is. How do you understand the decision now to sacrifice Andrea and her well-being over decades to keep the secret, do you think?
I mean, I think people, it's interesting because, again, we run back into Alice Munro's work, but that people keep secrets all the time of this kind, right?
Yeah.
And I do think that like the material factors that Zoe is naming are true. I also think there is like a certain amount in pretty much every abuse situation that I've ever either personally witnessed or witnessed as a journalist, a certain amount of willful blindness of this couldn't happen to me or the people that I know, and there must be something I'm not understanding or seeing when it's staring them plain in the face.
Right.
We've even seen like a little bit of that reaction, and some of the initial reaction was like, surely there's some part of the story that we're missing, right? But there isn't a part of the story that we're missing. Sometimes adults just don't do their best. And I think we have this unfortunate, and in especially white Canadian society, is sort of politesse kind of thing that goes on where people are like, well, I assume if I knew more, I would understand better. Especially because, Munro's revered as this great humanist. But I do think that in particular, that journalist that the stepmother was talking about at the dinner party, I'd like to hear from them. We've heard from Margaret Atwood as well, that she knew several years before the story broke about all of this. And she said she'd heard a rumor, but she wasn't sure. And I guess, not to put it all on her, it's just obviously it was going around. I would like to hear from someone who wants to explain themselves. I guess I will say that the biographer was at least brave to admit it. I don't understand a biographer who is afraid of reporting discord in the family, but it's, I'm glad that he admitted it so that at least that's out in the open.
Yeah, the idea of a biographer sort of shying away from this does seem like not part of the job description to me. I don't understand the decision either. But to that end, Michelle Cyca, when the new biography of Alice Munro is written, maybe 10 years from now, do you think this will be the headline or a footnote?
I think it'll be a pretty substantial piece of that biography for a couple of reasons. I mean, one is that this story, Andrea's story, really reflects and complicates Alice's writing because it's so bound up in the same sorts of things that she wrote about. So it's impossible to consider Alice Munro's work now without thinking about this. And the other thing is, Alice Munro is dead. This is the last chapter of her life. It's so damning. It's so detailed. Like the details are so unambiguous that I think there's no room in it for ambiguity or for sort of a self-defense. So many, many artists accused of terrible things have had the opportunity in their lifetime to try and reframe that narrative or downplay it or overcome it in some way. Alice Munro can't do that. And that's what her children wanted. I think they want people to continue. They said this in the Toronto Star. They want people to continue reading her work. They want the stories to stand on their own, but they want people to understand what she was like. And so I think it will be important. And I hope that, the distance between that first biography of Alice Munro that omitted this and the future ones that'll be written, what we can do with that hopefully is like reconsider how we write about and how we think about artists in their lifetime. Like there are living artists right now with similarly complicated or troubling rumors. I'm thinking of Louise Erdrich, who was married to another Native American writer who was accused of sexually abusing 2 of their children. And he committed suicide while being investigated. But like that's, Louise Erdrich is alive and publishing novels. So I think we need to not wait until people are dead to reckon with their lives.
Zoe, I got literally 30 seconds left, but I want to kind of leave it here. I want to leave it where we began, which is with Andrea. What has she taught you in sharing her truth with us, you think?
Well, I think that she's taught us, and I think what I'd like to take away from this is to, instead of talking about the art versus the artist, is that we really need to pay attention to survivors of child abuse and violence against women more. We need to speak about it in less mundane terms and recognize it for what it is.
I appreciate all of you being here. I appreciate you sharing your thoughts. This has not been easy at all. Thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Yes, of course. Michelle Dean is a lawyer, showrunner, and writer originally from the Ottawa Valley, now in Los Angeles. Zoe Whittall is an author in Prince Edward County, Ontario. And Michelle Cyca is a journalist and a member of the Musqueam Cree Nation in Vancouver. That is it for the show today. My name is Elamin Abdul Mahmoud. We'll be back tomorrow. I'll see you then.